Hi everyone, and welcome to our second webinar on our series on wildfires. Today we are going to be joined by Richard Whatley from the Kimberley Land Council, who's going to talk about Indigenous fire management. What we are going to have today is a seminar followed by a Q&A session at the end of it. So Richard, without further ado, thank you for agreeing on presenting, and the floor is yours.
Okay, no worries. No, it's really good to get these sort of invites and to know that people are interested in this sort of fire management work. To be honest, sometimes because it's all remote area work, you kind of get in your own little bubble a little bit, and you don't really go outside of that too often. So it's kind of a good opportunity for us to pass on of what's going on over in the Kimberley. I'm not sure if too many people online will actually know where the Kimberley is. It's basically northwest Western Australia. I'll have a few maps up shortly that'll give us a bit of a sense of the area that we're talking about. But I thought that I would start just by introducing myself and give you a bit of background on how I ended up in sort of remote Western Australia. I grew up on a farm in a place called Echuca, which is over the east, sort of on the border between Victoria and New South Wales on the Murray River. And we had a farm over there, a dairy farm. And it's irrigated agriculture over there. And I've always been pretty interested in the environment and the changes that I was seeing go on over in the east. Before everybody signed in, we were just talking about the Millennium Drought, which was a period in the sort of early 2000s where it just didn't rain, and got to see sort of the changes over on the eastern seaboard. Obviously, it's the opposite problem at the moment, and appreciate that everybody's probably signing in from flooded parts of Brisbane or wherever you are, and thanks very much for signing in. I went from Echuca and I went to Melbourne, and I studied journalism for a period of time at Melbourne University. It wasn't really my thing, and I just went out and was just working in construction, really, a whole series of different jobs, and then I lucked into a job surveying on the Eastlink project in Melbourne, which is land surveying. So we were doing the upgrade of the road there, and I discovered that I got jealous of the environmental guys on the construction sites because they seemed to have quite good jobs. And then I decided, after I'd done surveying for a while, I went overseas, and then I studied environmental science, sustainable management and sustainability at Deakin University in Burwood in Melbourne. And it's quite a broad course. I did wildlife biology first, and then I discovered that to go anywhere in wildlife biology, you had to do a PhD. And I was 27 at the time, so I thought that I could probably go into management. Sustainability seemed like a bit of a career path where I'd be able to get a job sooner, to be honest. And I kind of, after I finished university, mucked around a bit because environmental jobs are pretty hard to come by when you've just got that style of degree, like a really broad environmental science degree. And I ended up coming up to the Kimberley in 2014, and I worked for an organisation called the Australian Wildlife Conservancy. So they're based remotely on a station called Mornington, and they do a lot of different work. So my role there was weeds, a bit of aerial shooting, like feral animal work, feral animal control, hard-hooved herbivores, so donkeys, horses, and cattle, trying to eradicate them from certain areas, sensitive areas. A lot of fencing of those areas too, to keep cattle out. And a big part of it was a fire program. So that's where I learned the skills that I needed to do this job with the KLC. So now I'm the fire program manager with the Kimberley Land Council, and I'm based in Broome. So I guess the place to start with all of this is the history of fire in Australia. There's been a lot of studies on what used to take place pre-human settlement. There were still large fires in Australia, but they had natural causes. So lightning strikes, rock falls. The climate was obviously quite different pre-human settlement. But then when people come to areas, there's a really a marked change in micro charcoals in lake sediments. That's one of the ways that they tell where people are and when they've got to different places. I used to do a bit of volunteer work for a biologist at Deakin who went and cored old lakes on the Pacific Islands, and then he saw what animals were popping up in those sediments through time, and he could map when people are getting there. But one thing that you do see when people come to places and they're using fire, there's a lot more of it. So generally, it's still disputed in some places, but 65,000 years ago, they say, people got to the Australian continent. And there's still, as I said, a little bit of conjecture around that, when exactly people got here. And there's also a bit of argument, I guess you could say, as to whether people coming to the mainland led to the extinction of megafauna. Here we used to have wombats that were the size of cows and all this crazy stuff, giant goannas. But what's likely is that there was a combination of factors that led to the extinction of that megafauna, and some of those things is climate change. So you've had glaciation and different climate through time in Australia. And when people came, it doesn't necessarily line up with the extinction of megafauna. So when people came here, they're burning more. Indigenous people in Australia, they tend to have an oral history. They don't really have a written history. So it's very hard for anthropologists to try and go back through time and map out exactly what went on. But what you can do, or one of the things that you can use, is the early explorers' diaries. So when people came to Australia for the first time on boats, European settlement, they kept diaries. And in those diaries is something that's quite different to what was generally accepted. There's a record that is here from 1831. The natives are in the habit of burning thickets at intervals of 3 years to drive out tamar and banded hair wallaby. So that's down sort of in the southwest of Western Australia. And the fire history in the forests in the southwest now is one of exclusion. So there's not a hell of a lot of burning that goes on down in the southwest. Prescribed fire, early season fire, and as a result, you do see larger, more damaging late season bushfires. This one's 1834, January to February. Natives burn large tracts of country to catch wallaby or bush kangaroo. For this purpose, they generally go in considerable numbers and select a fine warm day, having a fired a portion of thick scrub or grass where they know these animals to live. They watch them being driven out by the fire, and they either spear them or knock them down with a short and rather slender baton called a tulita. The fires, when thus lighted, generally proceed spreading and consuming everything in their progress before the coldness and the dew of the night repress their fury, or intervening barren spots stop their rage, overrun some square miles of surface. So they're uncontrolled, large bushfires, basically. That's down in Albany, in the southwest of Western Australia. And we're starting to build a bit of a picture with these different records. 1837, again, people are out hunting, facilitate their hunting, and to afford young herbage to the kangaroos. And what that is green pick. And a lot of the pastoralists here still talk about green pick. They go and burn old grass to rejuvenate young shoots of grass coming up.
and then the cows go and graze those young shoots. So Aboriginal people over here were using it as a way to hunt. So they would set a fire, burn old grass, the young herbage would come up, and then the kangaroos go and feed on that herbage. And if you're doing it in small plots, you're basically making a hunting ground. Another one here, 1842. Consequence is that bushfires quickly spread over enormous areas, though without becoming a danger to human beings. And that's in New South Wales, and that's from Leichhardt. It's quite a famous explorer in Australia. And you think about those East Coast bushfires that we saw a couple of years ago, they were definitely a danger to human beings. So kind of the picture that we're getting here is there was a lot more use of fire when there wasn't population centres. Maybe it was easier for people to go out and do this regular burning. There's a lot of records of people just leaving, it's in that 1842 record, leaving their campfires unextinguished. And those fires are just getting away and then creating bushfires. But they're not travelling the distances that they do now. And obviously there's less population and those sorts of things. But it's just something to think about. In the 1800s, this is our first written record, and we're already seeing a picture of more fire in the landscape. So from those explorers' records and from the sort of fire history that would have been before human settlement, a lot of Aboriginal people are in the landscape, so they're dispersed pretty evenly around the Kimberley and other parts of Western Australia. And they're using fire for all sorts of different things. Cultural or ceremonial burning, they're using it for hunting, they're using it for cleaning up specific areas. So I don't know if anyone that's online today has been into the spinifex in the Kimberley, but walking through spinifex in a pair of shorts or bare feet is quite uncomfortable. You get spiked by the spinny, and it's not an enjoyable experience. So burn it. They used to walk around the countryside, and they would have burnt those places where they used to travel, and they would have had those lines through the landscape, burning them year on year. So that's ease of movement. To favour certain foods or resources, so they're pretty nomadic people, and they moved throughout the seasons up in the Kimberley in particular. And they burnt to encourage different plants, and they protected areas to protect fruit trees and those sorts of things that were really valuable to them. An example of that is on the Dampier Peninsula, we have these threatened ecological communities called monsoon vine thickets. One of the really important things for those rangers is to go and burn around those monsoon vine thickets to protect them every year, to protect the fruit trees from the fire. They use it for signalling. People will break down in a car and start a fire to let people know where they are. And it was probably no different back then. And for warmth, of course, and cooking and those sorts of things. So whether that was intentional or not, what it did is it created a mosaic of different age and fuel classes of vegetation. And because there was people throughout the Kimberley, everywhere through the landscape in their small land group, family group sort of people, they had boundaries of rivers and mountain ranges and those sorts of things. They were doing this over a landscape scale. And as a result of all of that burning, there's also a lot of animals that adapted to that fire regime over that, tens of thousands of years. So pastoralism in 1881, West Australian government gazetted a whole heap of land for cattle farming, gave the leases to different people, and Aboriginal people started to be moved out of places because they were eating the cows and causing economic losses for the pastoralists, basically. And they made missions up around different areas. They got people into those missions by using food, and that inevitably sort of moved people out of that traditional way of life and put them into settlements. So they're not dispersed through the landscape. They're not practicing that sort of traditional fire management anymore. Some of those pastoral stations still had Aboriginal people on them, and they still went and did that burning. So we didn't see the full effects until 68, 69, when Aboriginal people started to move off of the stations and into towns and those sorts of things, and really stopped performing traditional fire management. And I talked about some of the species that have adapted to fire management, or that style of fire management. We use these species that are pictured as indicator species. If you've still got good numbers of these species in the landscape, then they say that you've probably got reasonable fire management still. And that's because of the different plants and animals that these species use, and the fire regimes that these species like. So the first one up in the top there, if someone can chime in, can you see my mouse on the PowerPoint?
Yes. Yeah.
So this one up in the top left-hand corner is a purple-crowned fairy wren. They used to be really widespread through the Kimberley. They like pandanus and undisturbed riparian areas of creeks. And before cattle and bad fire management, they were probably a lot more widely dispersed, because a lot of the creek lines would have had thick pandanus. So one of the things that cattle do when they come into the landscape is they graze the riparian areas, and their hard hooves cause erosion and those sorts of things to the creek lines. And then you add into that poor fire management. So you have unmanaged fires that are moving through the landscape and impacting the creek lines late in the dry season, and they actually destroy pandanus. And so you lose purple crowns if you have really bad fire history. The plant in the middle there is Calitris intratropica. I think that it's been reclassified now, but I can't keep up, so I'll stop trying. But that's like an Australian pine, basically, or a cypress. The word for it, the Willigan word or Narrowin, is guru. And that's an important plant. It's an obligate cedar, and then the seedlings, they need like 5 or 10 years to come to maturity. So if you have fires coming through those areas every 2 years, destroys the seedlings, they don't come to seed and they disappear from the landscape. Starfinch, a little finch that has disappeared from some parts of the Kimberley, still up in the East Kimberley. And that's really closely related to the one below it, which is the Thorium Finch, which people may have heard of as well. It's a really popular aviary bird. They say that previous to European settlement, or when Europeans first arrived, they would see flying rainbows of these birds. And one thing that they like is there's a lot of studies on it of they use spinifex seed at a certain time of the year to survive. They're granivorous. So if your spinifex is getting burnt every 2 years, it doesn't come to maturity. It takes 3 years on average to come to maturity, and that's when it produces seed. And that food then disappears out of the landscape, and as a result, you lose the Gordian finch. So that's a really good indicator species, really widely travelled. There's a netting program that happened out of Mornington where they lit late season fires in areas, netted the Gordians, and then recorded their cortisol levels, that stress hormone, and found that when the birds had to travel long distances to access spinifex seed, they were a lot more stressed. So good fire management has returned reasonable numbers of Gordians to the Kimberley. The other one is a night parrot. So they need spinifex that is very, very old and samfire. So camels and stuff in the desert go and graze all the samfire off of the salt lakes. And the night parrot needs, it's only been rediscovered recently over in Queensland, actually, by a guy called Steve Murphy. He's the one who's been doing a lot of studies on the night parrot. They've recorded its call, and now that they've got its call, they put out these things called song meters, and they're rediscovering the range of the night parrot. They're finding little populations in Western Australia. They thought it was extinct. but it needs very, very old spinifex to nest in and to protect it from things like cats and foxes. They're another big problem over in the Kimberley. Feral animals do untold devastation to all of these animals. So the KLC program basically aims to train and equip Indigenous rangers and traditional owners with the tools and experience to conduct fire management across their native title areas. So the Kimberley is some ridiculous amount determined native title. I'm not sure whether too many people will know too much about native title that are online now. It's a really complicated thing, but we'll go into it in a little bit. So a large component of fire management here is in training and planning. And there's a lot of consultation because it's really complicated land tenure as well. So the green outlines on this map are all pastoral leases. So a lot of the time we'll have a native title claim, which will give the traditional owners sometimes exclusive access, but often non-exclusive possession native title. So they have some rights over the pastoral leases, but the pastoralist is still the person who can block access to those leases. So when you're trying to do a fire program, you have to consult with the pastoralist, you have to consult with the native title group, and you have to consult with a whole lot of other interested stakeholders to get your fire program done. And these are the groups that we're working with directly at the moment. Barragoo down in the desert, Nudura, another one down in the desert, Nungamata, Gurrajati, Nyul Nyul, Nimenwood, Bardi, Gidja, Nullaga, Balungari, Puniandi, and Niganamungala in the middle there. So they're all corporations and they have ranger groups attached to them. So this is a ranger group map of the Kimberley. So Indigenous rangers will be, a group will be set up to manage their country. And there's 21 of them apparently in the Kimberley, which is a hell of a lot. So you can see from this map that much of the Kimberley is managed in some respect by Indigenous ranger groups. And it's my job to go out and help those ranger groups to implement fire management. The previous map here, these are our directly assisted fire management areas. It's about 19 million hectares that we're working over at the moment with these groups. But as you can see, the non-involved ranger groups, they are running themselves now. They've divested from the KLC program. They've been upskilled to a point, or they've formed other partnerships where they can manage those areas themselves. So the structure of the organisation to deliver this work, KLC have got lawyers, anthropologists, and a land and sea unit. The lawyers and the anthropologists go and do the native title determinations and help us with all sorts of contracts and those sorts of things. But I sit within land and sea. So land and sea is the practical side of the Indigenous Ranger program. My boss is a guy called Daniel Odes from Bardi Jawi, a lot of experience in fire. We have a training coordinator. The training that the rangers do is all nationally accredited. They do Cert 2 and Cert 3, prescribed fire and assist with prescribed burning and respond to wildfire units. So they can be used to go and fight fires with parks, DFES, government agencies over here as well. And we do a lot of planning for the prescribed burning season, and I've got some assistance there by a guy by the name of Andrew Morton, who's got a really strong ecology GIS background. He's done a lot of work on radio collaring pigs, feral pigs, funnily enough, in the Kimberley. It's really, really interesting work. And he's very strong on GIS. You have to be when you're doing this fire planning work over here. And then Ewan Noakes, he's sort of a desert specialist, a lot of arid zone experience in burning, the sub 600 mil zone. We're broken into rainfall zones here. High rainfall is above 1,000 mil, low rainfall 600 to 1,000, and then the arid zones is sub 600. So how do you go about doing all of this burning? We don't necessarily get a lot of government funding The rangers are government funded; they're employed out of grants, but I'm paid by some wealthy people in America, and so are a lot of other people that work at the Klc in fire. There's a few different ways that you can fund a fire project. So over here, we've got the option to set up carbon projects, and this is a big interest for a lot of people now. They're sort of, they're set on a baseline. I'm going to show you a carbon project in a second. But basically, you get the previous 10 to 15 years of fire, and you say before fire management, this is what was happening with how much was getting burnt and the greenhouse gas emissions per vegetation type every year. You register the project and you start doing fire management, and then you can get paid by emissions avoidance. So if you're avoiding those emissions every year, when you've registered your project, you're generating ACCUs, so the Australian carbon credit, basically, and you can sell them, and that can fund your work. The other thing you can do is you can go and get grants from environmental organisations and land management organisations like Rangelands 10 Deserts Project, National Land Care Program, World Wildlife Fund, the Nature Conservancy, and some work over here is funded by private donors as well, usually wealthy people from overseas. Or you can ask the government, the Department of Fire and Emergency Services. They help the rangers with operational costs and firefighting and those sorts of things. And Parks and Wildlife, I assume that you've got Parks and Wildlife in Queensland. Here they're called the Department of Biodiversity, Conservation and Attractions. And they help the rangers too with a lot of work. They're responsible for all the fire management on unallocated Crown land outside of town site boundaries in Kimberley, and the parks as well. And then you have the rangers. So some of the guys, Nulliga, Garajati, and Silas is Nulliga as well. These are the guys that go out and implement the fire on the ground with our assistance. Early season burning, firefighting, and all of those sorts of things. At the KLC, we also have the assistance of the government in the Office of Bushfire Risk Management. So we have a fire operations manual that we work to. So it's quite a professional outfit for the rangers. They have to be trained. We function under ISO 31000:2018 risk management. And we use that fire operations manual to upskill rangers so they get used to working in a government system, because they have to eventually when you're doing fire management over here. And it's facilitated a lot of positive change. It's a really great program. It's the Obram Assurance Program. So this is a diagram directly out of our fire operations manual. It's really convoluted, but it gives you a bit of an insight into how complicated the different pieces of running a fire management program here can be. Over on the left-hand side, we've got a timeline. So that's through the year. The end of the previous year, once all your wildfires are done, you've got to get all your stakeholders in a room, or go and see them, look at maps with MODIS data off of Northern Australian Fire Information website, which I'll show you in a second. And you have to see where your late fires have been, where your early fires have been, and then you need to respond. So every year you have to burn. And if you don't, you run the risk of losing your whole fire project. So stakeholder consultation is number one here. And the KLC fire program is driven by native title holders. So first preference, we will go and talk to traditional owners and Aboriginal corporations and bodies corporate. And we'll talk to their directors, and then we'll go and see the really important traditional owners that have the fire knowledge. And we'll ask them for their opinion on what should happen for the year. And we'll go and put it into practice through our fire plans. So we develop a plan. We have a whole lot of checklists in there, and we have different people that are involved at every single level. Yeah, that's just as an example of how complicated fire management can be over here. So I thought I'd give you an example of some of the work that we do in mapping and with a project. So this is a carbon project, this project area, that map. This is I think it's about 633,000 hectares. Durack River Station and Kurunji Station. The red line is the boundary of the fire project. All those lines through the middle are old stock routes. So where they used to move cattle through the Kimberley before they could truck them around. You've got Gibb River Station out to the west, Allenbray. I don't know if anyone's been over to the Kimberley and been up the Gibb River Road. This is the Gibb River Road that sort of goes along the north of the project there. So a lot of tourist traffic up the Gibb River Road in the early season when we're trying to do our fire management. They all stop at Allenbray, have scones and stay overnight. And that distance from Allenbray here up to Home Valley, which is the next tourist place, is like 3.5 hours. So big distances, very, very remote. So this is a very remote area in the central Kimberley. That is pretty much the only road, is the Gibb River Road. This road here that comes down to the Kurunji homestead is a goat track, basically. You can't get down that road for 6 months of the year. So very, very remote. And as a result, we have to do a lot of aerial prescribed burning. There's no access. That whole Durack River Station, there is no roads on that station. So how do you get out into that area and do fire management or anything really to keep your fire project going? So Home Valley is a big tourist area. Alquestro, you've probably heard of, massive tourist area as well. Kachana is a sustainable pastoral station. They have like regenerative agriculture. It's fly in, fly out only. There's no way in there. Tableland is an area that's owned by Tableland Aboriginal Corporation. It's Willigan. Wood River is a big unmanaged, unallocated Crown land to the south. And unmanaged areas are a big threat to your fire project late in the season. Lots of lightning started fires will come off of unmanaged areas and impact your project. So a lot of different stakeholders, tourism, pastoral, DBCA and Willigan Aboriginal Corporation and Willigan Aboriginal Corporation over on Gibb River as well. And as you can see down in the south of Kurunji, really complicated boundary. Doesn't make any sense. It doesn't follow ranges or really rivers or anything. I don't know who, how or why they made up these boundaries. But when you're trying to put in fire breaks with boundaries like that, it is incredibly difficult. And as a result, you have to share your resources with neighbouring fire projects because you'll just fly straight across this little boundary here and put a line in from river to river, from the salmon to the wood, and put a fire break across there to stop fires coming from the south. So this is the Nullaga Rangers. These are the guys that are out there doing the work. It's been a long build up to getting this ranger group. They were no funding. The Kurunji and Durack are owned by the ILSC. So you have to go and find the money to do the work on the ground. And part of that was from ILSC, who have been great. The Nature Conservancy were giving us a certain amount of money for a number of years to develop this as a carbon project. And World Wildlife Fund, because that area has Thorium Finches, are willing to put money into grants as well for the rangers to go and do the work. So 2014 was really the first landscape scale aerial burning across the project by Anna Pickworth, who's now up at Kakadu, and then was carried on by a guy by the name of Richard Geddes, who he was at Bush Heritage for a period of time as the National Fire Program Manager, and Reece Swain, who used to work over here too. He's now the National Fire Program Manager at Bush Heritage. And the Willigan IPA coordinator, Indigenous Protected Area Coordinator, secured funding for this ranger team to develop. And then, of course, there's some other guys who work for Willigan. It's all very confusing, I'm sure. Willigan are the overarching native title holders. Nullaga Aboriginal Corporation are within Willigan. And then underneath both of those groups there's another prescribed body corporate called the Wandjina Ungud PBC. So native title is very, very complicated. And as a result, you've got about 3 different groups that you have to talk to before you can go and implement fire on that Nulliga Fire project. So this is the project, and this is hopefully a bit more interesting to some engineers. These are fire scars. They're sensed by the MODIS satellite, and they're updated by Northern Australian Fire Information and Charles Darwin University. And basically what this map is showing is that in 2006, the early season fires, which are green, were almost non-existent. You can see some along the Gibb River Road here, out on the western boundary, and up to the north, you can see some off Bindoola Creek, early season fires. But any fire that happened or occurred from August to December is mapped as orange. So all of that area burnt pretty much between August and December. And that for us is a bushfire because it's late in our season. The early season up here is when it's still wet. We have a wet season that goes from, say, November to about April. And you have to burn as soon as it stops raining. And then any fire that occurs after, say, July is generally a bad fire. It's a bushfire. So almost all of that fire project has burnt in 2006. 2007, everything that didn't burn the previous year and some that did, burns again late with those orange scars. We've had some bigger early season fires up here next to Allenbrae, but still that's a really bad fire year. And everything that was 1-year-old vegetation hasn't burnt. So that's what they talk about when we say a 2-year fire history. So a 2-year fire history is what you want to avoid. You don't want all of your project burning every 2 years. It's got bad environmental outcomes, bad social outcomes. It's bad for cattle. It's a bad fire history. 2008, pretty much everything burns again that didn't burn in 2007. So 2006, 2007, 2008. The difference being that you have this large early season fire out on Kurungi. So that is a prime example of a 2-year fire history. And these are the guys that started that early season burn in May out at Kurungi. This is a bull catching crew, a station crew. And often what they'll do when they go out mustering is they'll be based at Kurungi Homestead. They've driven down the track and they'll push a couple of little tracks in with a grader, or they'll just go out in bull buggies, which lots of people are more aware of now because you've got that Outback Wrangler or whatever it is on ABC TV. I don't know if any of you have seen that, but they chase the cows around with helicopters and catch them with bull buggies and muster them that way. So they don't necessarily need roads. They've gone out and they've lit a fire to clear some of the scrub. They've burnt along the river as well. And that is pretty much to get green pick, to draw the cattle in. So the cattle are coming in and grazing that green pick, and they can easily go out in a bull buggy and a helicopter and go and get all of those cattle. So they're doing the same thing as what people would have done in the past, most likely. So a really bad fire history. So what do those scars look like on the ground? On the left, you've got an early season fire. So it doesn't damage the tree canopy and it leaves patches of spinifex and other grasses within the fire scar, but it still makes a nice line, like a decent width patch of a fire break that's going to pull up late season fires. So that is an early burn. That's what you want to see. You reduce the fuel loads, you increase the mosaic, create fire breaks, and we use all of the modern tools that are available to us. And a lot of the time that's helicopters and satellite remote sensing. Over on the other side, you've got a late season fire. It burns everything. It reduces all of the trees and standing wood, all of the logs and everything that are on the ground to ash. And that's why they're worse for carbon emissions. So a late season fire releases more emissions than an early season fire. Even though both of them are still releasing emissions, an early season fire releases much less emissions than a late season fire. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to reduce your late season fires by using more early season fires. And I've got a video here of what an early season fire looks like from the air. Is that video playing okay for you guys? Yeah.
Yes.
As you can see, like this is on a Gidja project, and what we've done is we've run along the tops of these hills in the spinifex, and we've dropped incendiaries, which are basically like little matches. Potassium permanganate reacts with glycol. We use a machine called a rain dance. That rain dance machine drops incendiaries. So we fly lines along ridge tops and occasionally through valleys to make these little fire scars. And all we're doing is making breaks. So you can see not everything has cooked, and those fires are putting up nice white smoke. They're not damaging fires really at all. Sometimes they go too hot, like on the uphill there that you can see. But in general, a much less damaging fire than if you have a late season fire in the same area. And that's that big Gidja project. That's about 800,000 hectares, really complex, and a lot of fun to go out and actually do that firework on projects like that. It's really spectacular. This is Warren Jarlett, one of the Nulliga Rangers. He's operating the incendiary machine in the back of the R44 helicopter. Those little caps that are going into the machine have got potassium permanganate in them, and they're getting injected and cut one by one and dropped out of a pitot tube off the side of the helicopter. They've been injected with glycol. And the glycol causes a chemical reaction, takes about 60 seconds, and then they catch on fire on the ground once they've fallen through the air and shaken up. This is an example of an incendiary line. So everyone can see that, I assume. You can see the little dots. That's each incendiary that we've dropped. And you can also see the line. That is our fire break, basically. That is a planned line that we've got the satellite data from. We know that that grass is about 2-year-old. It's on some black soil. It's pretty fertile. We know that it's going to burn every 2 years if you don't go and burn it. So we're literally just creating smaller fires through the landscape in anticipation of the late season lightning strikes that are going to burn the whole thing if we don't have any fire breaks there. So if we leave that whole thing is going to burn in the late season. This is an example of a late season bushfire. This is what they look like when they're actually going. This one's down in the low rainfall zone, 600 to 1,000 mil zone in Gurrajati. And this is out of an R44. I've been sent out there with one of the rangers with a couple of leaf blowers, which is what we use for firefighting, remote firefighting here, to go and try and put it out. And as you can see, there's literally nothing that you can do about that fire. There's no fire breaks in the path of that fire. We had to let it burn about 1 million hectares before it came to the highway. We backburnt the highway to stop it from jumping over and continuing on all the way to the coast. So that's what a really bad late season fire looks like. They get up into the canopy and they just roll through, even in the desert. Here's Bayo. So this is an example of some of the firefighting that we do. He's lighting a line off the edge of a track out near down south of Broome. And as you can see in the distance there, that's a late season fire, which has been influenced by some of the coastal wind at that time. So that's why we were backburning now. But that fire was coming straight through a tourist area. So firefighting is a big part of running a fire project as well. So this is the Nulliga Fire Project sort of team. We registered a carbon project in 2017, which allows us to generate ACCUs and then to sell those ACCUs and get the money to run fire management. If we don't have funds, we can't do prescribed fire. It's very expensive because you have to use helicopters to do it. Takes a lot of staff. But in this picture, there's the environment manager from El Questro, tourism managers from Allenbray, members of a community at Gooda Gooda, 9 Mile, the Gidja Ranger Coordinator, the Gidja Nullaga Rangers, and a whole lot of TOs that came along to that fire planning meeting. And that map that they're holding up is the fire project with a time since last burnt layer over it, which is remotely sensed data. And that shows how old the grass is on that project. And they've drawn on it with texture, basically. And those texture lines are their planned incendiary lines for this year. And that's based on what burnt last year and how old the grass is. They're making cells. So these projects, they allow for better planning. They increase access to the area for traditional owners, because every time I go out burning, I've got one of these guys with me in the helicopter. It improves their social and cultural outcomes. They're getting training and they're employed to work on a project. And it enables control to be shifted eventually to those traditional owners. So once they're trained, some of these guys are getting up to, doing plan lines on ArcGIS and QGIS. Then they go out and navigate those lines in the helicopter, and they've got a career. And that's the whole point of what we're doing. Improves the environment, improves social outcomes, gives people work. So this is after registration of the carbon project. So this is the fire scars from 2017. We got pretty lucky in this year. We did put in aerial burns. You can see those little green dots in the landscape, but the MODIS imagery isn't able to pick up exactly what is there. You can see some of these fires out on the boundary with Gibb River. It's a really high fire frequency area, but we've managed to pull that fire up with some of our burning. It's pulled up some of that fire from coming in onto the project. 2018, a lot more early season burning has been put in. We still have late season fires, but they're contained in cells. So they're contained by our early season burns. They're not able to then spread out of those cells and damage the rest of the project. So we're pulling up those late season fires. We're stopping them from encroaching onto the fire project. So if you're not doing early season prescribed burning, this fire turns into a monster that takes out the rest of the project. This one at Royston Creek turns into a monster. So we're starting to see the effects of the burning that we're doing. That's 2019. So 2017, 2018, 2019. So already we've seen a pretty dramatic shift in 3 years from everything getting burnt. You can see the fires are still trying to come in off that Gibb River boundary, and previously that fire would have carried on all the way to the Chapman and the Durack River. These are our aerial controlled burn lines. So even though you can't see the scarring that's pulled up that fire, with this aerial controlled burn line, the iPad, we use an iPad to navigate. We use PDF maps. I only turn the PDF maps tracker on when I'm dropping incendiaries. So I'm dropping incendiaries on each of these lines. This one's been ineffective on the boundary, hasn't pulled up that fire, but thankfully this one on the range has pulled up the fire and stopped it from encroaching on the project. This line here's pulled up this fire from coming out of Royston Creek. These ones on the road haven't been that successful in pulling up the fire, but we must have got lucky with a bit of rain or something. 2020, when the fuel and the grass on the ground gets a bit older, you can start to really put in early season burns in a really effectual manner. So this is MODIS data that's been picked up, early season MODIS scarring. And it looks quite patchy, but when you put my flight lines on there, you can see really clearly the cells that we're trying to make. So with these lines, we're making cells of unburnt vegetation and we're bordering them with fire scars. So that's basically the whole aim of doing this burning, is to get those scars in, and then when you have late season fires, they can't travel I didn't change the colour on this one down in the south, I forgot, but that's a late season fire in this little corner of Wood River, which is trying to come up to the north, and it's been pulled up by our early season burn scars. This one over here as well. We have really rapidly improving technology over here that we're using to do this mapping. So previous to the Sentinel-2 satellite, we were using MODIS, and Charles Darwin University were producing fire scars about every 2 weeks during the fire season. So you would go out and you would do a run in the helicopter and drop incendiaries, and you'd get some burns in, and then you would have to go home and wait for 2 weeks. Charles Darwin and NAFI would upload the new scars, and then you could get those new shape files from the internet, put them on your map, and then you could go out and continue to try and do your burning. The advantage that we've got now is we've got access to Sentinel-2 imagery, and the MODIS satellite is 250 metre by 250 metre resolution, so quite coarse. Now with Sentinel, we can get down to, I think it's like 25 metres or something ridiculous. So what you're seeing here in this image is a Sentinel Pass in the black. And the Sentinel satellite's doing passes about every 4 days, and we've got a formula that we put into the European Space Agency website. Name escapes me at the moment. We put that formula in. It gives us a DMBR image. It basically shows what's burnt by doing a difference between moisture or something in the non-visible light spectrum data that Sentinel senses. So these are burns that you can see. And what I've done is I've layered them underneath the time since last burnt layer. So the light blue colour is 2-year-old grass. The light green colour is 3-year-old grass. Red is about 4. Dark green, we've got some up here near the road. That's up to 10-year-old grass, little patches of up to 10-year-old. So what I've done is I've accessed the Sentinel data after I've already done a run of aerial incendiary work out of the helicopter. You can see the aerial incendiary lines really clearly in that scarring. And then I've just put in burn lines that I need to go and navigate and join the dots. I have to draw lines in these gaps. And then I need to fly out in the helicopter, turn on the incendiary machine and fill that gap, and fill that gap, fill that one. And what I'm doing is I'm using the wind direction. So often you'll have an easterly. So that's why this one is up on the north east of these scars, because that easterly is going to drive that fire into those existing scars and fill that gap. Does that make sense? Yeah, no. So these are the scars here. And this is my proposed burn line. And I fly that line with an easterly, and I turn the incendiary machine on, drop, matches are dropping out of the bottom of the helicopter all the way up until we hit that next scar. And then we're making a cell. So this is a cell here. If there's a lightning strike in this cell late in the year, it's going to burn this grass. It's definitely going to burn all that 4-year-old. We'll burn that 3-year-old. It'll take out that entire cell. And if I don't have every single one of these little gaps stitched up, then we're going to have to fly out there with leaf blowers, and we're going to have to try and blow out the fire before it can move through those gaps. Because once it's through those gaps, it's in a whole nother cell, and it's going to take out the rest of that veg. And that's all money because it's carbon emissions. So this is what that project area looked like at the end of our early season burning in 2021. So really, really effective cells that we had formed up in that fire project. None of those fires have got too crazy. there is still some quite large scars down in the south, and you can even tell the intensity of some of these fires from that scarring. But overall, pretty good. We're in really good shape for the end of the season with that map. And then this was the end of the year. So these are the late season fires. We still had this year fires running around in at Christmas time, which is ridiculous. Fires in the Kimberley, even in the low rainfall zone, should not still be doing damage in late December. And some of these, there's actually fire scars on this project in January of this year. And that's one of the first times that I've seen fires burning in January here. It's terrifying. The conditions were such that we were still having those really intense fires late in the season and causing a lot of damage. But you can see our burning has pulled up a lot of late season fires. So even along the road here, there's 1, 2 separate ignitions that haven't travelled, another ignition, so 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. This is Kachana, hasn't come into our project because we've got these over here. So I'm going to call it 8, 9 separate fires where in the past, any one of those fires could have burnt out 60, 70% of the project. They're now much reduced in their effect over the project area. So this is one of those late season fire frequency maps that I was talking about, and it's a comparison over a 10-year period. So this records every single fire scar after July for every year over those 10 years. So every late season fire, 2000 to 2009, before planned and implemented early season prescribed fire, the fire frequency, the late season fire frequency, the really damaging fires, is much, much higher than the same 2011 to 2020 10-year period underneath. So massive difference. And don't forget, we've only started implementing sort of ad hoc aerial burning in 2014. So we're missing a couple of years there. And one of the aims now is to see that map improve even more and really turn this fire history around and improve the environment out there and reduce emissions. And here's some figures. Like, it's very easy to prove that this does have a positive effect on fire project areas. The actual figures for those same periods, 10-year periods, the total area burnt. So even though we've increased the amount of early burning, so we're actually going out and lighting fires, we've increased the amount of early burning by about double, let's say. We've decreased the late burnt percentage by, 6% something. We've also reduced the area of that fire project that's getting burnt every year by a factor of almost, 5. So you can see that it definitely does have an effect, and that going out and lighting fires early in the season reduces total fire extent. And then we've got a comparison of when we've registered the project, 2017 to 2020. I don't like these figures because I think they're a little bit misleading, but a late burnt reduction by astronomical figure and a total burnt percentage astronomical as well. But I think that we really need more time before we can do these figures justice. So Indigenous owned carbon projects, which we have registered up here of the type of Nullaga, they allow ranger groups and traditional owners to access country and to the funding to implement good fire management. And that's an example of good fire management, that image that you can see. You can really clearly see that fire break that has travelled through the landscape through aerial incendiary burning, and it's divided 2 patches with the fire scale. So now groups like Nullaga Aboriginal Corporation, they're free to choose how and who assists with their fire management. And hopefully in the near future, they start working with Willigan and Indigenous people directly to implement this fire. My whole role is to work myself out of a job, is to train Indigenous people to do this work themselves. And that's every aspect of this work. Chase the grants, do the planning, do the GIS, access the data, do the stakeholder collaboration and facilitate the fire project, and they can do it. So we really want to increase our collaboration with the Department of Fire and Emergency Services and Parks and Wildlife in the future. They hold the keys to pretty large areas of land, and at the moment we've got a situation where rangers, if there's a late season fire on a national park in the Kimberley, if the rangers, even though it's a native title area, if they're not Parks and Wildlife employees, they're not allowed to go and put that fire out. DFES run the pastoral burning program. It would be great to get some rangers up working with pastoralists to do the burning as well. We want to manage the area across the whole Kimberley Ranger network, so Kimberley wide, towards the common goal of tenure blind management. You can't have those boundaries in fire management because the fires just jump over boundaries. So if you don't have tenure blind management of fire, which we're in a really fortunate position, it's still achievable up here. I don't know if it's achievable on the East Coast anymore, but here it's definitely achievable to work with your neighbours and put fires across boundaries early in the season. We want to increase the professionalism of the rangers and get even more respect for Kimberley native title holders to manage and care for their country and culture. We want to register the rest of the carbon projects that native title holders and pastoralists have access to in the Kimberley. The low rainfall zone is all registerable now. There's new methods coming in the 2022 method, new vegetation types, pin down vegetation type is going to make a lot of projects that weren't viable previous to this method. It'll make them viable. The federal government today has just gone some ways to destroying the carbon price in Australia, which is going to have long-lasting effects for the viability of these projects, which is very, very unfortunate. We want to continue to improve risk management in our organisational systems to upskill rangers, and we want to see the sub 600 zone registerable. So the CDU, Charles Darwin University, are in the process of doing some assessments of vegetation in the 500 mil zone to see if carbon projects are viable, and the registration of those projects is worthwhile if it's going to save enough emissions to generate ACCUs. And we want to increase desert burning. And the desert is kind of a forgotten aspect of Australia. We're really fortunate to be working with one of the partners now is the 10 Deserts project, which was, I think it was a BHP innovation that funded a lot more aerial prescribed burning in the desert. And we had a mega fire in the desert, in the Great Sandy Desert in 2017 that burned at least 3.8 million hectares. And you didn't see anything about it on the news. But these fires are becoming more and more common with climate change. And obviously climate change is one of those challenges that is affecting our whole program. Our fire season is shifting to earlier in the season. We have to start burning. We also have to go firefighting all the way through our late season as well to stop those late season damaging fires. And that's about all I've got for today. I think I made it the full hour.
Thank you, Richard, for this whole presentation on Indigenous fire strategies. I think we are receiving some questions from our attendees. So, yeah, one of our colleagues has one question. Would you like me to read for you, or you'd be okay with bringing it from the chat?
One sec.
Yep.
I'll see if I can find it. Yep. Some drivers on the nearby highway died in a fire. Invasive plants in the Kimberley.
Yeah, if there are any.
Do we have issues with invasive plant species in this area? Yeah, we do. So greater grass is a big issue in the Kimberley. It has a really high biomass. It grows really tall, and it outcompetes about 80% of native grass species. So that was one of the things that I was engaged in AWC, was to try and we did a landscape scale aerial spraying program where we were trying to spray greater grass and stop it from invading different areas. It's called greater grass. It starts on the sides of the roads. You've got a big problem with it over in Queensland, and that does change fire regimes. The fires burn hotter, and they do a lot of damage to trees because it is so much higher and it has a high biomass. They're more intense fires. Fortunately, it hasn't spread too far beyond a couple of the really intensive pastoral areas in the Kimberley, but it is probably insurmountable at this time. But what we're really lucky that we don't have over here is gamba grass. So I don't know if anyone's familiar with gamba grass over there. They call it elephant grass. Can get up to 3 meters tall, and that outcompetes 100% of native species apparently, including kills the trees when it burns, and then just takes over entire landscapes. And that's one of the species where if you register a carbon project, or you're trying to register a carbon project and you have gamba grass in your project area, you have to exclude it from the project. You can't include it in the carbon project area. So that has really terrible economic implications if you've got a project area with a lot of gamba grass and trying to treat that too. I don't know about the people on the highway that died in a fire. I haven't heard that one, but yeah, 2009. Yeah.
Right. Thank you for your answer. So still talking about species, but more about the animals there. You mentioned them at the beginning, beginning of your presentation, and some of the attendees caught their eye on them. One of our attendees was wondering if about those species, if you have any figures or data that suggest they are thriving again after the controlled burnings.
Yeah, so there's a long running project at Mornington Station. So AWC, Australian Wildlife Conservancy, are pretty heavily involved in recording small mammal numbers. They have a set of survey sites, and they're really one of the organisations that's got long-standing data, and all of it is related to fire management in different ways, because they started their fire projects and they moved a whole heap of researchers out to Mornington Wilderness Camp and Research Station in about 2004. So they've got long-term small mammal data, and there's a lot of papers from Mornington, and there's also a lot of papers from the Northern Territory on the increase in small mammal numbers with improved fire regimes and Gordian finch numbers. And if people are interested, I can they're all in papers. I can share them with you if you like.
I can send you the links to those papers and you can have a read for yourselves. A lot of the data for fire management as well it's extrapolated across the north, across the savannah. So we don't have the manpower or the ability to go and do those long-term surveys. But many people that run fire projects over here will use data from the NT and from Parks and Wildlife and AWC and extrapolate that across the landscape. And it's definitely possible to extrapolate it across the landscape because a lot of the vegetation types are very similar across the savannah and through the rainfall zones. The other part of it is it's very easy for us to prove the change in fire history from MODIS data because the MODIS data exists on Northern Australian fire information from all 2000. Like they started doing all of this mapping in the year 2000. So we've got 21 years of data to fall back on now for the fire scar mapping. And people are actually going back through time as well. WWF and one of the groups up here called Woonabulgumbra and Charles Darwin University have gone back and redone a lot of fire scar mapping from Sentinel imagery through time, back as far as the Sentinel imagery will go. So they actually have really valuable fine scale fire scar data all the way back to the Sentinel satellite as well.
Right. Yeah. Thank you for your answer. And also some like out of curiosity, you made pretty clear how you start the fire line, like the ignition, but how do you determine the location of that? Of the points for the incendiary lines.
Okay. I don't know how deep you want me to go into it. Do you want me to just show you a map quickly?
Yeah, sure.
So what I'll do is I'll just open up ArcGIS and I'll literally show you how we do it. It's basically based on the Sentinel data from the previous year of our early season fire scars, the topography, so a digital elevation model we use as well. And 1 second. So a lot of the time I use water courses and digital elevation models to plan exactly where we're going to put incendiaries and the previous year's fire scars. So I'll just scoot this up and I'll share my, can you see that?
Yep.
You can see Arc?
Yeah.
So this is the Balungari fire project in the North Kimberley, and the layers that I've got on this map are sandstone heath, which is a threatened ecological community, a vegetation type that needs exclusion, fire exclusion for long periods of time, which is getting harder and harder to do up here. So that's all mapped by CDU as well, and that's the green thatch. Then this orange colour is late season fires from last year. So obviously there's not too much point going and trying to burn a late season fire scar from the previous year. These grey marks are the Sentinel early season fire scars from 2021. And then all those different colours are the age of the fuel. So same scheme as last time. Blue is 2-year-old, green is 3-year-old, brown is 1-year-old, but most of the brown is underneath these Sentinel scars. And then I just literally draw lines based on topography and trying to make cells of vegetation so that if there's a lightning strike in one of these cells, it can't move into the next cell. So a good example, maybe we can go up north here and we can have a look at some of these flats. Another thing that I've got access to in this map, see these little red dots?
Yep.
Every single one of these red dots is an art site or a burial site. And one of the things that Aboriginal people will do in the Kimberley, I'm not sure where else they do it, but I've seen a lot of it in the Kimberley, is they the thigh bones and the skull of a deceased person is coated in ochre and wrapped in paper bark and put up into a cave.
Mm-hmm.
See the topography underneath the map there. This is along the King George River. If anyone's ever seen the King George Falls, it's a big twin waterfalls right up the top of the Kimberley, a really remote area up north. Really, really important area for Balungari people, all of these sites. And what you can see is over next door, this is a pastoral station. We're not allowed to do early season burning on this pastoral station. Pretty much every single one of those art sites and burial sites that's recorded in that area got cooked in a late season fire on that pastoral station. Because that pastoral station, Carson River, does not do any early season fire management. So those early season scars are the grey ones, and you can see that there's hardly any early season burning over on Carson River. So that is a massive threat. And those fires that start on Carson, this is one of them, jumped over the King George and encroaches onto our fire project. So I was up on this fire with one of the rangers, Wayne. That was the photo of him turning around in one of the slides with his thumbs up or whatever in the front of the helicopter. We'd just finished putting out this fire down here with leaf blowers trying to stop it late in the season, and that had jumped over the King George from a lightning strike and come onto our project area. And it's worth going and putting that fire out. So the other thing that I do with these lines is follow boundaries, watercourses, and the topography. So we're trying to hit tops of hills in most cases. So going along, hitting the high areas because they're curing faster. So when you're doing incendiary lines on hilltops, because it's cured and it's not down in a creek line, it's probably going to burn earlier and a little bit cooler because the fire's burning downhill. If I had have run some of these lines, say over here, for instance, you can see you've got a hill over here, a really pronounced sort of cliff line. I could run along the bottom of this cliff line early in the season and send that fire straight up that hill and have a nice clean line. But then I'm also going to kill all of the plants and shrubs that are on that hillside. So you hit the tops of the hills and hopefully that fire will burn down the hill. This also, I know it's going to burn, and I know that I'm going to be able to burn that flat across there. That's down in the lowlands in a creek line, because it's 3-year-old. So the 3-year-old grass is definitely going to take, and we'll be able to get nice lines through there. Down here, I'm coming out, going onto the flat using this creek line, probably with an easterly, burn into that creek, get a nice line along the creek, because the vegetation along the creek line is going to cure a lot slower than the stuff that is a little bit out from the creek. So I'm a couple of 100 meters off the creek line with an easterly, burning into the creek. It won't damage the riparian vegetation because it's still wet and it's an early season fire. So I'm just hoping to get a nice clean line through there. So that's basically what I'm working on. I'm also working on burning into 1-year-old. I know that I've got an easterly at that time of year. It's really regular in the Kimberley that you get easterlies in the dry season, the early dry season. And I'm putting incendiaries directly to the east of these existing 1-year-old fire scars. So that fire is going to burn, hit that 1-year-old, and it's not going to damage any of the riparian vegetation along the King George River. That's also on that really fertile flat there. It'll definitely burn every year. That was that illustrative photo that I was talking about at the start of my presentation. That line, that big curve that went in and hit the river, that's what that photo is from. That's from that incendiary line right there up on the King George. And that's King George Falls. So lots of tourist boats and things going there. All these lines that are up in this very old grass near the tourist sites, they're going to need to be done within, the next couple of weeks. Just when it first stops raining, we'll go up there.
Yep. Yeah, pretty complex. Like there is a lot of criteria that you have to take into account to define these lines. So it's not a straightforward process.
Yeah, it's really difficult. Yeah. It also has different curing across the project. So this project's 1.2 million hectares. And it's divided by a couple of ranges and a few major rivers, Delancort, Berkeley, King George. This eastern side is a lot more rock and totally different vegetation type than the western side. So you have to know the soil types of the areas, how much moisture they hold, so that then you can go out and burn them at the right time. And you have to know where you can burn them into as well by using creek lines. Because if you go out, this is up to 10-year-old spinifex on the coast in Sandstone Heath. If I went out and dropped an incendiary in the middle of that, even now, all of that would burn and it would go hot. So it's quite complex planning that you have to do to actually go and do the lines.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. So Richard, just last one in interest of time. We already saw it's pretty complex to determine the places for the incendiary lines. So besides getting funding and maybe these aspects, what's the most challenging aspect of implementing this fire program?
Just having the time to be able to go and do the burning. So this project area, last year I spent 116 hours in the helicopter actually doing the burning. So it's a really big investment in time. I'm based in Broome. This fire project is out of Wyndham up in the north. So Wyndham is 1,000 kilometres away from Broome. I have to get up there and we have to burn this whole project in at the right time. And if we're not there with the right weather and the right conditions, you have similar to what happened up here. Even in the early season, you can see that big grey lodge. That's an early season fire that I made a mistake with one of my incendiary lines, and it cooked a big patch of 3-year-old grass. And that was just because of the conditions on the day, and I lost concentration. So that is the hardest part of doing these projects. You can make mistakes that have huge environmental and ecological negative effects, I guess, and it can be quite stressful. So yeah, the hardest part is just being there, trying to be there to actually implement the burning in the right way, I would say. Having the time to be able to get up and do the burning, as well as all the political stuff that comes along with it.
I see. Yeah, it's pretty complex and great responsibility.
Lots of fun.
So, yeah, I can guess. Richard, it's been a pleasure to have you today. Thank you for your presentation, for your openness to answer all of our questions. It's been really insightful to have you today. Maybe on the side of, actually using fire to fight fire, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, exactly. No, thanks very much for the opportunity to talk to you. It's been really good. And yeah, hopefully I've given you something to think about, and hopefully I hear from some of you with amazing new projects or ways that we can improve our fire management in the future. That'd be fantastic.
For sure. Yeah, thank you very much. And if you have any resource you want to like us to forward to our members, feel free to do so. We'll be sharing the recording for this session early next week with the resources you sent through.
No worries.
Thank
Thanks.
you very much. Thank you.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye. And to all of our attendees, I would also like to share our invitation for our next seminar on modeling fires at the wildland urban interface. That's going to be next Friday, also at 4 p.m. Australian Standard Time. So please register. Thanks for attending today. See you soon and have a good weekend. Bye.